George III ruled Britain for 60 years. He oversaw wars on 4 continents, lost an empire in America, and kept governing through all of it, right up until the autumn of 1788, when the people closest to him began to notice something was wrong. Not a fever, not an injury, something no one in the palace had a word for. What followed was one of the most documented collapses of a human mind in recorded history, and it happened while he was still on the throne. You're going to want to stay for all of it. The Man Before the Storm. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was there. George III was born on June 4th, 1738 in London. He was the eldest son of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. His father died unexpectedly in 1751 when George was only 12 years old, which pushed him to the front of the line of succession, years before anyone had expected. That sudden shift, from a boy with time to grow to an heir who had to be ready, shaped everything about him. His grandfather, George II, never particularly warmed to him. There was always a distance there, a coolness, the kind of gap that forms between generations of a royal family when grief and politics get in the way of ordinary affection. George grew up in a household that was, by the standards of the time, relatively private. His mother, Augusta, was deeply protective of him, perhaps overly so. She kept him close, monitored his education, worried about the company he kept. The result was a young man who was in many ways remarkably earnest. He worked hard at his studies. He had a genuine passion for agriculture, not a fashionable hobby, but a real, hands-on interest in farming and land management that would follow him all his life and earn him the affectionate nickname Farmer George. He was curious about science, about mechanical things, about how the world worked. He collected clocks and scientific instruments. He read widely. He was by most accounts a thoroughly decent, conscientious and sincere person. He was also, by his own admission, deeply anxious about the responsibilities ahead of him. He came to the throne in October 1760 at the age of 22, following the death of his grandfather. His coronation took place in September 1761. By that point, he had already made one of the most consequential decisions of his personal life. He had chosen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz as his queen. The two had never met before their wedding day. Charlotte arrived in England, married George within hours of her arrival, and the two of them began building what would become, by the standards of European royalty, where love matches were almost unheard of, a genuinely warm partnership. They would have 15 children together. 15! 9 sons and 6 daughters. The family was enormous, loud, and by all accounts affectionate. George loved his children. He played with them. He worried about their education, their character, their futures. Later in his life, when things began to go wrong, the thought of his family was one of the few things that could anchor him. But in those early years, the family was just beginning, and so was the reign. The Britain that George inherited in 1760 was a global power in the middle of an extraordinary transformation. The 7 Years' War was still underway, a conflict that stretched from Europe to North America to India to West Africa, and Britain was winning. By the time it ended in 1763, Britain had emerged as the dominant colonial power on Earth. Canada was British. Much of India was falling under British influence. The Navy was the strongest in the world. It should have been the beginning of an era of confidence. Instead, the decade that followed was one of the most politically turbulent in British history. George came to the throne with his own ideas about kingship, ideas that immediately set him on a collision course with the existing political establishment. He believed genuinely and deeply that the monarch should be more than a figurehead. He wanted to govern, not just reign. He wanted ministers who answered to him, not to parliamentary factions. He wanted to restore what he saw as proper royal authority. This was not a popular position. The political world of 18th century Britain had been built, over the previous century, on the principle that Parliament was supreme and that ministers governed with its consent. George's determination to be an active king created friction almost immediately. His early reign was marked by a rapid turnover of prime ministers, 7 in the first 10 years, as he struggled to find ministers who could both work with Parliament and with him. And then came America. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies had been simmering toward conflict throughout the 1760s. The costs of the 7 Years' War had been enormous, and Britain felt that the colonies, which had benefited enormously from British military protection during that war, should help pay for it. A series of taxes were imposed. The colonists objected loudly and furiously. Parliament backed down, then tried again. The tension escalated steadily throughout the late 1760s and into the 1770s. George III himself was not the architect of the policies that pushed the colonies toward rebellion. That is a simplification that history has repeated so often it has become difficult to dislodge. He was, however, a stubborn defender of parliamentary authority over the colonies once the rebellion began. When the war broke out in 1775, George did not waver. He believed the colonies had to be brought back to obedience. He pursued the war with determination, even as it became clear that it was going badly. He resisted calls to negotiate. He resisted calls to concede. He lost. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognized American independence. It was a humiliation unlike anything Britain had experienced in living memory. For George personally, it was a blow that sat heavily on him for years. He had believed in the cause. He had pushed for it. He had refused to let it go even when wiser voices counselled compromise, and he had failed. There is a letter he wrote in the aftermath, drafting in his own handwriting his intention to abdicate. He never sent it. He stayed. But the letter exists, and it tells you something. The weight he felt, the shame, the sense of personal failure that was pressing down on him in those years. He was in his mid-40s. He had been king for more than 20 years. He had a large family, a kingdom he still loved, and a genuine desire to do his duty. He had no idea what was coming for him. What the next few years would bring was something no one around him had ever seen before, and something that would change the way the world understood the connection between the body and the mind, between a king and his crown, between power and its limits. It began with a stomachache. But a stomachache was only the surface. What lay underneath was about to surface in ways that would shake the entire British political world to its foundations and force an answer to a question no one had dared ask out loud. What do you do when the king can no longer be king? The first crisis. The autumn of 1788 had been, by the standards of royal life, a reasonably ordinary one. George was 50 years old. He had survived 2 decades of political turbulence, a lost war, and the complicated business of managing a very large family. His health had given him some trouble over the years. There had been a brief, puzzling episode of illness back in 1765, which had caused some concern at the time before resolving on its own. But he was, on the whole, considered a healthy man. He rode, he walked, he worked. He kept regular hours. In June 1788, he began to show signs of abdominal pain. He was unusually tired. His sleep was disturbed. Over the summer months, the symptoms came and went. Nothing dramatic enough to cause serious alarm, but enough that his physicians were paying closer attention than usual. Then, in October, things changed. The king began to talk very fast. This might sound like a minor thing, but it was noticed immediately because it was so unlike him. George was not a rambling man. He was earnest, careful, deliberate in conversation. He took things seriously. He chose his words. The sudden flood of speech, rapid, pressured, running from one subject to another without the usual pauses, was strange enough that the people around him began to exchange looks. He also began to stay up at night. Not the restless insomnia of a worried man, but something more agitated. He would be up at odd hours, moving through the palace, talking. His attendants and pages, the men who were with him almost constantly as part of the machinery of royal life, noticed the change and noted it with growing unease. By November, it was impossible to pretend that everything was fine. One of the most striking accounts from this period comes from Fanny Burney, the novelist who served as second keeper of the robes to Queen Charlotte. Burney was an acute observer, thoughtful and articulate, and her diaries from this period are among the most vivid records we have of what the household was experiencing. She described an atmosphere of barely contained panic, the Queen weeping in private, the attendants unsure of their duties, the whole ordered world of the court suddenly feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath it. The behaviour the king was displaying by November 1788 was alarming. He talked almost without stopping, sometimes for hours at a time. His speech became incoherent, jumping from subject to subject in ways that made no sense. He spoke of things that were not happening. He recognised people incorrectly. He would address servants by the wrong names, or speak to absent people as if they were present. There were moments of agitation, of strange physical restlessness, of behaviour that his attendants struggled to describe and his physicians struggled to explain. At one point, during what was meant to be a family dinner at Windsor, the king seized one of his sons by the collar and pinned him against the wall. The incident horrified those present and was quickly hushed up, but it could not be forgotten. This was not a man who had ever been violent. This was a man who had spent 30 years being notably patient and gentle with his family. Queen Charlotte was terrified. Her husband, the man she had lived with for 27 years, the father of her 15 children, had become someone she did not recognise. She stopped sleeping in the same rooms as him. She moved her furniture. She sat up at night listening to sounds from other parts of the palace, afraid. The physicians were at a loss. The medicine of the late 18th century had no real framework for understanding what was happening. Mental illness, the phrase itself did not yet exist in the way we understand it, was seen through a moral and religious lens as often as through a medical one. There were theories about the animal spirits, about imbalances in the body's fluids, about the effects of diet, climate, and stress on the mind. There was a general understanding that people could lose their reason, but the causes were murky, and the treatments often made things worse. George's physicians argued among themselves. Some believed the illness was primarily physical, a result of the abdominal trouble that had been present since the summer. Some believed it was a mental fever, a temporary derangement of the brain that might resolve on its own. One physician, Sir George Baker, bore the brunt of the blame as the king's condition worsened, accused by political enemies of mismanaging the case. Into this chaos, in late November 1788, came a man named Francis Willis. Willis was not a fashionable London physician. He was a country doctor from Lincolnshire, in his late 60s, who had made a reputation for himself running an establishment for the treatment of people with mental disturbances. He was recommended by a bishop who knew him, and Queen Charlotte, desperate, frightened, willing to try anything, agreed to bring him in. Willis's arrival at court was controversial from the start. The other physicians resented him. Some members of the government suspected his motives. He was an outsider, a provincial, a man whose entire practice was built around patients that polite society preferred not to think about. But he came with something the others did not have: experience. He had been dealing with mental illness for years. He had seen behaviour like the king's before. He was not frightened by it. Willis's arrival at court was controversial from the start. The other physicians resented him. Some members of the government suspected his motives. He was an outsider, a provincial, a man whose entire practice was built around patients that polite society preferred not to think about. But he came with something the others did not have: experience. He had been dealing with mental illness for years. He had seen behaviour like the king's before. He was not frightened by it. His approach to treatment was based on a principle that sounds simple, but was, at the time, genuinely radical: control. Willis believed that patients could be managed, that the disordered mind could be brought to heel through a combination of discipline, restraint, and the careful management of the patient's environment and stimulation. He spoke quietly and firmly to the king. He established himself as an authority figure. He imposed a routine. There was a moment, recorded in several accounts, where the king looked at Willis directly and told him that the biblical King Lear had also been attended by clergymen who went on to do him harm. It was one of those flashes of lucidity, sharp, pointed, the king's own wit briefly cutting through the confusion, that made those around him realise that some part of him was still present, still watching, still capable of a kind of awareness even within the illness. The remark landed heavily. Willis, by most accounts, absorbed it without visible reaction. He also used what was called the restraining chair. This was not, by the standards of what was done to people in similar situations in that era, an extreme measure. What was done to patients in the various institutions of 18th century Europe was often far worse. But for a man who was King of Britain, the experience of being physically restrained, strapped into a chair when he became agitated or violent or simply too difficult to manage, was a profound indignity. George was aware enough of what was happening to resent it. He called Willis a quack. He threatened him. He was furious. And gradually, over the weeks that followed, he began to get better. By February 1789, the physicians were cautiously noting improvement. The rapid speech was slowing. The incoherence was becoming less frequent. He was sleeping more regularly. He could hold a conversation. He could recognize people correctly. He began, slowly, to sound like himself again. On February 26, 1789, Willis formally declared the king recovered. The relief across the country was enormous. The celebrations were genuine. George III was popular, genuinely deeply popular in a way that many monarchs of the era were not. He was seen as a decent man, a father figure to the nation, a king who cared. The illuminations, the church services, the crowds that gathered in London to celebrate the news, all of it reflected real feeling. But in the background, the political world had been watching events at Windsor and Kew with very different eyes. Because while the king was confined to his room, unable to govern, unable to sign documents, unable to conduct the business of state, the question of what to do about it had very nearly torn the country apart. And the men who had manoeuvred most eagerly during his illness were about to face a reckoning that neither side had fully anticipated. The Regency Crisis. The Constitution of Britain in 1788 had never fully reckoned with the possibility of an incapacitated monarch. The king was at the centre of the political system. He appointed and dismissed ministers. He gave royal assent to legislation. He was, in the formal language of the time, the executive. Without him functioning, the machinery of government was, in a very practical sense, broken. There was only one obvious solution: a regent. Someone who would exercise the king's powers on his behalf while he was unable to do so himself. And the obvious candidate for regent was the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, who was already 26 years old and as the heir apparent the natural choice. The problem was that the Prince of Wales was, in the deeply uncomfortable political language of the moment, a Whig, and the government of the day was Tory, led by William Pitt the Younger. This was not a trivial distinction. If the Prince of Wales became regent with full royal powers, he would almost certainly dismiss Pitt and his ministry, and replace them with his political allies. The entire balance of power would shift overnight. The Whigs, who had been out of office for years, would come in. The Tories would go out. Everything would change. Pitt was not willing to let this happen without a fight. What he proposed was a limited regency. The Prince of Wales would become regent, but with significant restrictions on his powers. He could not create peers. He could not grant pensions from the crown. He could not remove the king's household or appoint new members to it. In effect, he would be a regent in name only, a caretaker rather than a full substitute for the king. The Prince of Wales and the Whig opposition, led by Charles James Fox, were furious. Fox argued that the prince had an inherent right to the regency, full and unrestricted, as the natural heir to the throne. To impose restrictions was to trample on his constitutional rights. The debate that followed in Parliament was one of the most intense of the century, not because either side had the better of the pure constitutional argument, which was genuinely uncertain, but because everyone understood that what was really at stake was who held power. It went on for weeks. Bills were drafted, speeches were made. The Whigs expected to win because they expected the king to remain ill. The whole calculation was based on the assumption that George III was not going to recover. And then he did. The timing was almost theatrical. The Regency Bill was still working its way through Parliament in February 1789 when word came from Windsor that the king was improving. Within days it was clear that the crisis was passing. The bill was abandoned. Pitt stayed in office. The Prince of Wales retreated, humiliated and furious, to Carlton House. The episode left scars. The prince never forgave his father's ministers. The relationship between the king and his eldest son, already strained, became something colder and harder. Fox and the Whigs had shown their hand, and shown it with an eagerness to assume power that made them look, to many observers, opportunistic at best. Pitt had manoeuvred with considerable skill, but the whole affair had revealed how fragile the political system was when its central figure was removed. The parliamentary debates during the crisis were a spectacle that drew enormous public attention. Pitt and Fox, two of the most gifted political minds of the century, men whose rivalry had defined British politics for a decade, argued across the floor of the House of Commons with a ferocity and brilliance that observers remembered for years afterward. Fox, who had built his entire political identity on the principle of parliamentary supremacy, found himself arguing for the prince's inherent constitutional rights in ways that sounded uncomfortably like the very claims of prerogative power that he had spent his career opposing. Pitt, who had been the champion of royal influence in earlier controversies, now found himself arguing for parliamentary control over the exercise of royal power. Both men were, in a sense, arguing against their own most deeply held principles because the real argument was about power, and power has a way of rearranging principles to suit itself. The public was watching, the press was watching, the caricaturists were watching. James Gilray produced some of his most devastating work during these months. Images of Fox and his allies gathered like vultures around the royal throne, images of Pitt conducting the political orchestra for his own benefit, images of the king himself in states of agitation that would have been unpublishable if the political stakes had been lower. The whole affair turned the private suffering of the royal family into a very public drama, and the people observing it drew their own conclusions about the men competing for power over a man who was unable to defend himself. And George himself, what did he make of what had happened while he was ill? He was told, carefully and in stages, about the political crisis that his illness had provoked. He was told about the restraining chair. He was told about some, though certainly not all, of what he had done and said during the worst months of his illness. He was mortified. He was a man of deep personal dignity, who set great store by self-control and proper behaviour. The knowledge that he had been raving, incoherent, violent toward his own family, this hurt him in ways that were not easy to express. He threw himself back into his duties. He worked hard. He was determined to demonstrate that he had fully recovered, that he was the same man he had always been, that the illness was behind him. He took up his agricultural projects again. He spent time with his family. He did his best to behave as if the autumn and winter of 1788 to 1789 had not happened. For a while it seemed to work. The 1790s were, in many ways, a period of relative stability for George personally. The Revolutionary War in France and then the wars against Napoleon consumed the political world entirely. Pitt's ministry became consumed with the war effort. George was supportive, resolute, deeply patriotic in a way that resonated with the public. He was seen as the steady centre of a nation at war, the farmer king who embodied the solid English virtues that stood against the upheavals sweeping France. His popularity remained high. The assassination attempts, and there were several, including 2 incidents at the theatre in 1800 where shots were fired at the king, seemed to confirm rather than diminish public affection. The crowds who gathered after each attempt were there to celebrate his survival, to express relief, to reaffirm that they wanted him there. But those who were closest to him could see that things were not entirely right. There were episodes, brief, minor, nothing like 1788, but noticeable. Moments of unusual agitation, nights where the old restlessness returned, complaints about his eyesight, which had been worsening for years. A general sense among the physicians and the household staff who paid attention to such things that the crisis of 1788 had not fully resolved, that whatever had happened to the king, it had not been cured. It had been paused. In 1801 it came back. The second episode was shorter than the first, less dramatic in some ways, but no less frightening to those who witnessed it. It followed, interestingly, a period of intense political stress. The Act of Union with Ireland had been pushed through in 1800, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Pitt had promised Catholic emancipation as part of the deal, the idea that Catholics in Ireland would be given the right to sit in Parliament and hold public office. George III refused, absolutely and completely. He considered Catholic emancipation a violation of his coronation oath, a betrayal of the Protestant constitution. Pitt resigned. Within weeks the king was ill again. The symptoms were familiar: the rapid speech, the sleeplessness, the incoherence. Willis's sons were called in. Francis Willis himself was now very elderly, and the same techniques of management and restraint were applied. Again the king recovered. Again the relief was genuine. Again he returned to his duties with determination. But the pattern was becoming visible: stress, conflict, the kinds of pressures that had been building through his reign. These seemed to have some relationship to the episodes. Not a simple, predictable relationship, but a connection that people noticed. The third episode came in 1804, shorter again, managed, resolved. And then came the year that changed everything. In November 1810, George's youngest and perhaps most beloved daughter, Princess Amelia, died. She was 27 years old. She had been ill for some time with tuberculosis, and her death had been anticipated, but anticipation did not make it easier. George had visited her sickbed regularly, watching her weaken. He had been given a lock of her hair to carry. When she died, something in him broke. Within days of Amelia's death, the king fell ill for the 4th time, and this time he did not recover. The final descent. The autumn and winter of 1810 and into 1811 saw the king deteriorate in a way that could no longer be managed or concealed. The symptoms were all the familiar ones: the rapid speech, the sleeplessness, the confusion. But now they did not pass. They deepened. They took hold. The brief periods of clarity that had always eventually pulled him back became shorter and less frequent, and then, slowly, stopped coming at all. By the end of 1811, it was clear that George III would not be governing Britain again. The Regency Act was finally passed in February 1811. The Prince of Wales, the same prince who had waited so eagerly back in 1788, became Prince Regent with, after a period of initial restriction, full royal powers. He would hold those powers until his father died 9 years later. He would govern Britain through the final years of the Napoleonic Wars, through Wellington's campaigns in the Peninsula, through the burning of Washington, through Waterloo. George III, meanwhile, was at Windsor Castle, in rooms that had been adapted for his residence. He could no longer see clearly. His eyesight had failed almost completely by this point, and his hearing was also deteriorating. He lived in a world that was becoming increasingly closed to him, the external world fading while the one inside his mind grew stranger and more distant from reality. The accounts of those who saw him in these years are among the most affecting documents of the period. He would play the harpsichord. He had always loved music, and he retained a kind of connection to it even when much else was gone. Sometimes he would play for hours, the music coming back to him in ways that conversation did not. He would play pieces he had known for decades, running through them again and again, finding something there that comforted him. He spoke to people who were not present. He held long, rambling conversations with politicians who had been dead for years. He would speak to Pitt, who had died in 1806, as if he were in the room. He would talk to Lord North, his Prime Minister during the American War, who had also been dead for years. The conversations were sometimes coherent in their way, internally logical, following their own strange rules. He grew a long white beard, which would have horrified the man he had been. He had always been careful about his appearance, attentive to the dignity and formality that the position demanded. Now he wandered the rooms in his dressing gown, the beard growing, the appearance of royalty completely gone. There were those in his household who still treated him with the full ceremony due to a king. His dressers, his attendants, the pages who had spent their careers in his service. Many of them continued to bow and observe the proper forms, even as the man who wore the crown was absent in every meaningful sense. There is something deeply human about that, something that speaks to loyalty, to the idea of the office itself as something worth honouring even when the man holding it was no longer there. His sons came to see him when they could, or when they were allowed. The Prince Regent, who was now effectively running the country and living a very different life at Carlton House, came occasionally. The visits were often difficult. George would not always recognise his visitors. He would sometimes become agitated. The sons who came away from those visits did not speak easily about what they had seen. Queen Charlotte continued to live at Windsor, in the rooms she had moved to during the first crisis in 1788, and never fully moved back from. She remained close, maintaining the household, overseeing the arrangements for the king's care, growing old alongside him while he lived in his separate world. She had married him as a teenager with no knowledge of him, settled into what became a genuine partnership, and now watched him disappear by degrees. She died in November 1818, a year and a half before he did. The world George had known continued outside the walls of Windsor to change enormously. Napoleon rose and fell. The Industrial Revolution was remaking the landscape of Britain and the nature of work and society. Steam engines, factories, cities growing with unprecedented speed. A world that would have been difficult for the young king of 1760 to recognise. Inside Windsor, time moved differently, or perhaps it did not move at all. In the last months of his life, George is described as largely quiet. The great storms of agitation had passed. He moved slowly, carefully through familiar rooms. He ate, he slept. He played the harpsichord when the mood took him. He spoke sometimes, in ways that made no sense to those who heard him, in a language of his own. He died on January 29, 1820. He was 81 years old. He had been king for nearly 60 years. His death was noted with a kind of melancholy respect. He had been so long away from public life, so long confined to Windsor, that in a sense Britain had been grieving him for years already. The formal mourning was genuine but subdued. He was old. He had suffered. The ending of his suffering was, in its way, a relief. He was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, beside the Queen who had preceded him, and the question that had hung over his final years, the question that his physicians had never been able to fully answer, was left to subsequent generations to wrestle with. What exactly had happened to George III? The men who had treated him offered confident explanations, but those explanations, it turned out, were only the beginning of a debate that would last for more than 2 centuries, and that would eventually lead researchers back to something hidden in his own hair. The doctors and the diagnosis. The men who treated George III during his various episodes did not lack confidence. They had their theories, their treatments, their certainties. They argued with each other constantly, about causes, about methods, about who deserved credit when the king improved and who bore blame when he did not. But they were working in the dark. The medicine of the late 18th century was in a transitional state. The old framework of humours, the theory that the body's health depended on the balance of 4 fundamental fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, was finally beginning to loosen its grip on medical thinking, but it had not yet been fully replaced. What came after was a period of competing theories, none of them well supported by evidence, all of them practised with more confidence than the results deserved. For the king's abdominal symptoms, the physicians prescribed a range of treatments that were standard for the time. Purges, emetics, restricted diets, tonics. The idea was to clear whatever obstruction or imbalance was causing the trouble. Whether any of these helped is doubtful. Some almost certainly made things worse. For the mental symptoms, the approach was the one Willis had brought to court: management, control of the patient's environment, reduction of stimulation, physical restraint when necessary, firmness, routine. The theory behind this approach was not entirely wrong. There is something to the idea that a disturbed mind benefits from reduced chaos in its surroundings. But the methods were, by any later standard, brutal in their application. George was blistered. This was a standard medical treatment of the era, intended to draw out whatever was causing the illness by raising welts on the skin. He was given emetics that made him vomit. He wore a restraint around his arms during some periods. He was placed in the restraining chair during episodes of particular agitation. He was, on at least some occasions, gagged to prevent the continuous speech from exhausting him. The physicians who applied these treatments believed they were helping. Willis in particular was convinced that his methods worked, and the fact that the king did recover, at least in 1789 and in the subsequent shorter episodes, seemed to confirm this. The problem, of course, is that we have no way of knowing whether the recovery happened because of the treatments or in spite of them. By the 19th century, as the king's final illness settled in and made clear that he was not going to recover this time, the question of what had caused it all became a live one for the medical men of the era. A number of theories were proposed. The dominant explanation for most of the 19th and 20th centuries was that George III had suffered from a hereditary mental illness, at various times called periodic insanity, or simply madness, whose nature was poorly understood but whose symptoms matched broadly what we might now call a mood disorder. The rapid speech, the sleeplessness, the grandiosity, the agitation, the periods of apparent recovery, these fit a pattern. Then, in 1969, 2 psychiatrists named Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter put forward a different theory. Working from the historical records, the physicians' accounts, the letters, the observations of those who had been present, they argued that George III had suffered not from a mental illness in the modern sense, but from a physical condition called porphyria. Porphyria is a group of disorders that affect the production of heme, the compound that makes blood red and that plays a crucial role in carrying oxygen through the body. In certain forms of porphyria, particularly acute intermittent porphyria, the disorder can produce a range of physical symptoms including abdominal pain, muscle weakness, and discoloration of the urine. It can also produce neurological symptoms, confusion, hallucinations, agitation, rapid speech, behavioral changes. McAlpine and Hunter argued that the abdominal symptoms, the dark or discoloured urine that had been recorded in the physician's notes during the king's episodes, and the pattern of acute attacks followed by recovery, all pointed to porphyria rather than a primary mental illness. The theory was widely accepted for several decades. It had the appeal of providing a physical explanation for what had looked like a mental collapse, of turning madness into medicine, in a sense. It also fit with observations that some other members of the royal family, going back several generations and forward to descendants, had shown similar symptoms, suggesting the hereditary pattern that porphyria would produce. But the porphyria theory has been challenged in more recent years. In 2010, and subsequently, researchers examining the historical records more carefully, including, in some cases, actual samples of material preserved from the period, argued that the evidence was not as clear as McAlpine and Hunter had believed. The symptoms, on close examination, did not match any specific form of porphyria particularly well. Some of the crucial pieces of evidence, like the reports of discoloured urine, were inconsistent or could be explained by other causes, including the medications the king was given. A different analysis by a historian and researchers working with the original medical records suggested that what George had experienced was more consistent with what we would now call bipolar disorder, episodes of mania followed by periods of recovery, with the final decade representing a permanent state of decline rather than a final acute episode. The symptoms of the 1788 crisis in particular, the pressured speech, the sleeplessness, the grandiosity, the periods of agitation alternating with relative calm, the response to firm management of his environment, fit the pattern of a manic episode with reasonable consistency. There is also the matter of arsenic. In 2004, researchers analysing samples of the king's hair, preserved, as was common practice at the time, in various collections, found extremely high levels of arsenic. This was a remarkable finding. Arsenic at those levels would be capable of causing or exacerbating neurological symptoms. It could also be absorbed through a number of routes that were entirely normal for an 18th century man of means. Certain medicines, certain cosmetics, certain dyes used in clothing and wallpaper. The popular arsenic-laced green wallpapers of the period are one candidate. Some of the medicines given to the king himself almost certainly contained arsenic compounds. The arsenic finding does not resolve the question of diagnosis. Arsenic poisoning and porphyria can produce overlapping symptoms. Arsenic poisoning and a primary mental illness can coexist. The king might have had a genuine mental illness that was made dramatically worse by chronic low-level arsenic exposure. He might have had porphyria, complicated by the same exposure. The symptoms, filtered through the limited observational abilities of 18th century medicine, may simply be too imprecise to allow a definitive diagnosis 230 years later. What the medical history does tell us, unambiguously, is that George suffered, that he was in physical pain during the episodes, that the treatments applied to him, the blistering, the restraints, the purges, were often painful and rarely helpful, that the men responsible for his care were doing their best within a system that did not yet have the concepts or tools to help him. The diagnosis, in the end, may matter less than the experience, and the experience was, by any measure, terrible. What followed from his illness, though, both the political fallout and the way Britain handled the question of a king who could not govern, shaped the constitutional history of the country in ways that echoed for generations. The world he made and the world he left. The irony of George III's legacy is that many of the things he is remembered for are not quite what they seem. He is remembered as the king who lost America, and he did lose America. But the suggestion that he was the primary cause of American independence is a later construction, built partly by American patriots who needed a villain, and partly by his British opponents who found it convenient to blame the king for what was, in truth, a collective failure of British policy. The decisions that led to war were made by Parliament and ministries as much as by George himself. He was stubborn in his pursuit of the war once it began, but stubbornness alone does not explain the outcome. He is remembered as the mad king, the cautionary tale, the monarch who lost his mind, and that happened, undeniably. But it happened to a man who had governed Britain for more than 50 years before the final darkness descended, a man who had shown, for most of that time, considerable political skill, genuine personal decency, and a real understanding of his country. What he actually built over those 60 years is worth looking at carefully. When George came to the throne in 1760, Britain was a significant European power engaged in a global war. When he left it, or rather, when the Regency effectively ended his active reign in 1811, Britain was the dominant power on earth. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. The Industrial Revolution was creating a form of wealth and economic power that no previous civilization had seen. British institutions, Parliament, the common law, the idea of constitutional government, were influencing reformers and revolutionaries around the world. George did not cause the Industrial Revolution. He did not invent the steam engine. But he reigned over the period in which all of it happened, and his personal qualities, the stability, the commitment to duty, the genuine Englishness that made him popular, contributed to an atmosphere in which those things could happen. He kept the country together through the French Revolution, when the radical ideas sweeping France might have destabilised Britain far more severely than they did. He maintained the constitutional order when it was under pressure. His relationship with his ministers, particularly with Pitt the Younger in the crucial years of the 1780s and 1790s, shaped modern British government in ways that are still felt. The working relationship between a constitutionally limited monarchy and a Prime Minister who led the House of Commons was, in George's time, still being negotiated and defined. The Regency crisis of 1788 to 1789 forced a clarification of what the Constitution meant when the King could not function. The arguments made in Parliament during that crisis, and the resolution that followed, established precedents that would matter for the next century. The relationship between George and Pitt the Younger deserves a moment of particular attention, because it was one of the most consequential political partnerships of the era. When Pitt came to power in December 1783, he was 24 years old, the youngest Prime Minister in British history. George had appointed him in circumstances that many observers considered a royal coup, using the King's remaining constitutional prerogatives to install a minister who did not yet command a parliamentary majority. It was exactly the kind of active, interventionist royal behaviour that George's critics deplored. And then Pitt won the election of 1784, justifying the appointment and silencing, at least temporarily, those who said it had been unconstitutional. For the next 17 years, until Pitt's resignation over Catholic emancipation in 1801, the two men worked together through the most turbulent period in British history since the Civil War. They disagreed at times, genuinely, seriously on matters of real importance, but they shared a fundamental commitment to the stability of British institutions, a deep hostility to the revolutionary ideas sweeping France, and a determination to win the wars that those ideas had generated. The partnership worked in ways that neither man's temperament on paper should have permitted. The elderly, stubborn, moralistic king and the brilliant, cool, somewhat remote young Prime Minister finding enough common ground to govern a country at war. Pitt died in January 1806, worn down by decades of war, politics, and what were almost certainly the effects of the alcohol on which he had relied heavily throughout his career. He was 46 years old. George wept on hearing the news. Pitt had been more than a minister. He had been, in some sense, a companion through the worst years. He was also personally a significant patron of the arts and sciences in ways that tend to get overshadowed by the drama of his illness. He founded the Royal Academy of Arts in 1768 with Joshua Reynolds as its first president. He built up the Royal Library, a collection of some 65,000 books that he donated to the British Museum in 1823, forming the core of what would eventually become the British Library. He supported astronomical research and the project to determine longitude at sea. He was interested in music, was a serious amateur musician himself, and was a patron of Handel's works long after others had moved on to newer fashions. These were not the interests of a frivolous man. They were the interests of someone who genuinely cared about knowledge and culture, who saw himself as a steward of something larger than his own reign. His children, for all the difficulty of the family in his later years, also left their mark. The Prince Regent became George IV, and, whatever his personal failings, oversaw a period of remarkable cultural florescence in Britain. His other sons, the Dukes of York, Clarence, Cumberland, and others, were figures of varying degrees of usefulness or notoriety in the political and military world of the early 19th century. His granddaughter, Victoria, would become Queen in 1837 and reign until 1901, presiding over the full flowering of the empire that George's reign had helped create. But perhaps the most lasting thing George III left behind was something harder to measure, a demonstration of what happens when the machinery of constitutional government is tested by the incapacity of the person at its centre. The Regency crisis of 1788 to 1789 showed the weaknesses in the existing arrangements. The Regency Act of 1811 showed what it looked like when those weaknesses were finally addressed. The fact that Britain was able to continue functioning, that the wars were fought, that Parliament sat, that the courts administered justice, that the economy grew, during the years when the king was unable to govern, was itself a demonstration of how far the country's institutions had developed from the days when the monarch's personal capacity had been the hinge on which everything turned. This was not, of course, the lesson anyone intended to teach. It was simply what happened. But it mattered. It mattered to the men who reformed the Constitution in the 1830s. It mattered to the politicians who debated the role of the monarchy throughout the 19th century. It mattered to the architects of modern constitutional monarchy, who drew on the experience of the Regency as evidence that the system could survive without an active king. George III had spent his reign arguing that the monarch should be more than a figurehead, that the king should govern as well as reign. He had pushed back against those who wanted to reduce the crown to pure ceremony. And then, in the final decade of his life, while he sat in his rooms at Windsor, growing his white beard, playing his harpsichord, talking to men who had been dead for years, the country had quietly proved that it could do without him. It is hard to know whether, had some part of him understood this, he would have found it reassuring or devastating. The people around the king. No account of George III's life can be complete without the people who were there through it, the ones who watched him, cared for him, suffered alongside him, and in some cases made his suffering worse. Queen Charlotte comes first, inevitably. She had arrived in England in September 1761 as a 17-year-old girl from a small German duchy, having been selected as a suitable consort with the same dispassionate efficiency that European royalty applied to such decisions. She had no say in the matter. She spoke little English. She knew no one. She married a stranger within hours of landing on British soil. The marriage, against all reasonable expectation, worked. Not in a passionate, romantic sense. That was not the language of royal marriages, but in the deeper sense of two people finding, over time, that they genuinely understood and respected each other. George was faithful to her for their entire marriage, which was itself unusual enough in the context of 18th century royalty to be worth noting. He spent time with her. He valued her opinions. When things went wrong, she was the person he turned to. The crisis of 1788 destroyed something between them that never fully recovered. Not the respect, not the care, not the formal relationship, those continued. But the physical intimacy, the easy companionship of shared rooms and shared routines was gone. Charlotte moved her furniture. She slept separately. She lived in a state of quiet, sustained terror that expressed itself in the accounts of those around her as a kind of rigid self-control. She kept herself together by keeping herself separate. She was 54 years old in 1818 when she died, worn down by decades of anxiety and the weight of watching her husband disappear. She was described in her final years as withdrawn, careful, a woman who had learned to expect the worst and found that the worst usually came. Her relationship with her daughters was the complicated emotional centre of her later life. She had 6 of them, and the conventions of the time, combined with the particular anxieties created by the king's illness, meant that they were kept unusually close to home. Royal daughters were expected to marry, but the king and then the regent were both resistant, for different reasons, to the marriages that were proposed. Several of the princesses spent decades waiting for lives that never quite arrived. Princess Augusta, Princess Elizabeth, Princess Mary, Princess Sophia, Princess Amelia. Their lives were lived largely in the tight orbit of the court, waiting and hoping and aging, in ways that at least some of them found deeply unhappy. They wrote letters to their brothers and to their friends that speak of longing, of boredom, of the peculiar suffocation of royal domesticity. One of them, Princess Sophia, had a child in circumstances that were quietly suppressed and never formally acknowledged. The full story remains murky, but the outlines are clear enough. A young woman in a restricted world with very few options. Amelia, the youngest and perhaps the most beloved, wrote to her father regularly during the years of her illness. Her letters and his replies have a raw tenderness to them that is almost painful to read. She knew she was dying. He could not accept it. when she died in November 1810, giving him a mourning ring made from her own hair as her final gift. Something in him that had been holding on gave way. His sons are a different story. George IV, the Prince of Wales, the Prince Regent, eventually the King, was in many ways his father's opposite. Where George III was moderate, self-controlled, domestic and earnest, the Prince of Wales was extravagant, self-indulgent, politically crafty and personally unreliable. The two men had been in conflict for decades. The prince's debts, his lifestyle, his political alliances with his father's opponents, his marriage to Mrs. Fitzherbert, and then the subsequent marriage to Caroline of Brunswick that produced a daughter and immediately collapsed into mutual loathing. All of it was a source of grief and embarrassment to the king. There is a moment recorded in several accounts where George III wept openly on receiving news of one of his son's scandals. He wept for the dishonour to the family, for the behaviour he had tried to prevent, for the son who had turned out to be so different from everything he had hoped. It is a human moment, stripped of all the pageantry, just a father crying over a son who had disappointed him. Frederick, Duke of York, was in some ways more straightforward, a military man, commander-in-chief of the British Army, bluff and competent and generally considered more reliably decent than his older brother. But he was also implicated in 1809 in a scandal involving his former mistress selling military commissions in his name. The scandal forced him to resign his command temporarily, and George, by then already in the early stages of his final decline, was spared the full weight of it. William, Duke of Clarence, the future William IV, was the most plainly decent of the sons, though plainly decent is not a phrase that suggests heroism. He had spent years in the Navy, which had given him a practical, unpolished quality that made him popular with ordinary people. He lived for many years with the actress Dorothea Jordan, with whom he had 10 children, before abandoning her late in his life to marry a princess for dynastic reasons. The abandonment is hard to defend, but he was, on balance, an affectionate father and a straightforward man. The doctors deserve a separate accounting. Francis Willis remains the most significant of them, the man who came in during the crisis of 1788 and applied the methods that most clearly represented the state of psychiatric care at the time. His approach, firm management, physical restraint when necessary, the deliberate establishment of authority over the patient, was seen by his contemporaries as evidence of real expertise. He had spent decades working with patients that most physicians refused to take. He knew what he was doing, in the sense that his methods produced visible results, even if those results came at a significant human cost. His sons, John and Robert Willis, continued the family practice and were called in during the subsequent episodes. They used the same methods, with the same results. Improvement for a time, followed by relapse, followed eventually by the final descent from which there was no return. The other physicians, Baker, Reynolds, Warren, the various men who had been present from the beginning, were less sure of themselves. They argued. They contradicted each other. They competed for influence over the case and over the ear of the Queen and the politicians. Some of them were more interested in their own reputations than in the king's health. The picture that emerges from the historical record is not a flattering one, but they were working at the edge of what was understood. The science did not yet exist to help them do better. The most that can fairly be said is that they tried, in the context of their time and their training, and that the limits of their care were the limits of their era, not simply of their character. There is one other figure who belongs in any accounting of George III's inner world: Handel. This is not a person who was present in his final years, obviously. Georg Friedrich Handel had died in 1759, a year before George came to the throne. But George's love of Handel's music was one of the constants of his life. He had grown up with it. He attended performances. He knew the music deeply. There is a famous account of the coronation of George II, which the young George attended as a child, at which Handel's coronation anthems were performed, the massive, thrilling choral works that remain some of the most recognisable pieces of music from the period. In his final years, as the world closed in around him, as the faces of the living became confused with the faces of the dead, as the political world he had spent 60 years navigating became as distant as a half-remembered dream, the music remained. He played it. He hummed it. Something in those deep grooves of memory held on longer than much else did. It is perhaps the most human detail in a story full of human details. Not the king, not the constitutional monarch, Not the figure in the history books who lost America and went mad, but a man in a room, playing music he had known all his life, holding on to something when everything else was going. What followed, and why it matters. The death of George III in January 1820 did not mark the end of the story that his life had set in motion. In many ways, it marked the beginning of the reckoning. The most immediate consequence was constitutional. The regency, which had been running since 1811, ended with his death and the Prince Regent became George IV. But the experience of the regency, 9 years of governing without an active monarch, had changed things permanently. The question of what the monarch was actually for, in a country with a functioning parliament and a prime minister who commanded a majority, had been answered in practice if not in theory. The monarchy was important, but it was not the hinge of government. The country had worked without it. This realization fed directly into the debates of the 1820s and 1830s about parliamentary reform and the nature of the constitution. When the Great Reform Act was passed in 1832, it was not, in any direct sense, a consequence of George III's illness, but it was part of the same long process by which Britain worked out what kind of country it was, whether power belonged to the king, to the aristocracy, to Parliament, or in some meaningful sense to the people. The experience of the Regency had shown that Parliament could function as the primary engine of government. It had shown that the king's personal capacity was not the essential thing. This lesson, absorbed gradually and imperfectly by the political culture of the early 19th century, made the Reform Act possible and made the subsequent evolution of constitutional monarchy, in which the sovereign reigns but does not govern, intellectually acceptable in a way it might not have been before. The impact on attitudes toward mental illness was slower and more complicated. George III's illness was, in the language of the time, a source of great embarrassment and considerable fascination. It was discussed, carefully, in the elevated language of medical reports and parliamentary debate. But it was also suppressed, minimised, kept as quiet as possible, given that the patient was the king of the country. The physicians who treated him were sworn to discretion. The courtiers who witnessed the worst episodes were expected not to speak of it. The public was given carefully managed versions of events. But the fact that the King of Britain had lost his mind, had become, in the terms of the era, a lunatic, was impossible to keep entirely quiet. People talked, caricaturists drew, pamphlets circulated. The cartoonist James Gilray produced some of his most pointed work in the context of the Regency crisis. Images that were savage in their political content and which touched, obliquely but unmistakably, on the reality of the king's condition. The public conversation about mental illness in Britain changed in the years following the king's first episode. The establishment of the Select Committee on the State of Lunatics in 1807, which led eventually to the County Asylums Act of 1808, reflected a growing sense that the way society treated people with mental illness was inadequate and in many cases cruel. The conditions in institutions like Bethlehem Royal Hospital, which had been notorious for generations, began to receive serious scrutiny. This was a slow and deeply imperfect process. The reforms of the early 19th century were significant, but they did not transform the situation overnight, and the history of institutional psychiatric care throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries contains examples of cruelty, neglect, and abuse that are deeply troubling. The idea that mental illness was a medical condition rather than a moral failing, that the person suffering from it deserved care and dignity rather than shame and confinement, took generations to establish fully in either law or culture, but the fact that the most powerful man in Britain had been seen to suffer from mental illness, publicly and unavoidably, did something to the conversation. It made the subject harder to dismiss. It made the sufferers, the thousands of ordinary people confined in terrible conditions in institutions across the country, slightly less easy to pretend did not exist. There is also the question of what George III's story did to the reputation of medicine itself. The performance of the physicians during the various episodes of the king's illness had been, on the whole, not impressive. The disputes between them, the treatments that caused pain without clearly providing benefit, the confusion about causes, the uncertainty about prognosis, all of this was on display, in a case that the political world was watching closely. The subsequent career of Willis and his sons, trading on their reputation as the men who had cured the king, taking in wealthy patients at their private establishment, charging fees that only the privileged could afford, did not reflect particularly well on the medical profession. The early 19th century saw serious efforts to reform medical education and practice in Britain, to establish clearer standards, to create bodies that could regulate who could call themselves a physician and what they were entitled to do. The College of Physicians, the Royal College of Surgeons, the Apothecaries Act of 1815, these were part of a larger effort to make medicine more accountable, more scientific, more professional in the modern sense of that word. George III's illness had been, in its way, a very public demonstration of what happened when medicine was practiced without adequate knowledge or accountability. The reforms that followed were not a direct response to his case. The causes were multiple and complex, but his case was part of the landscape that made reform seem necessary. The diagnosis debate revisited. The question of what actually afflicted George III has never been fully settled, and in recent decades it has become something of a small scholarly industry in its own right. Historians, physicians, psychologists, and geneticists have all brought their different methods to the same set of historical records and come away with different conclusions. The porphyria theory, as noted earlier, was dominant for several decades after McAlpine and Hunter proposed it in 1969. It had the virtue of explaining the physical symptoms, the abdominal pain, the dark urine, alongside the behavioural ones, and it fit with the observation that similar symptoms had appeared in other members of the royal family. McAlpine and Hunter traced the hereditary line backward through Queen Charlotte's family and forward through some of George III's descendants, arguing that a porphyria-carrying gene had been present in the royal bloodline for generations. This genealogical argument attracted significant attention and not a little controversy. Some historians felt that the evidence for the diagnosis in earlier generations was too thin, based on descriptions of symptoms that could fit any number of conditions. Others pointed out that the McAlpine-Hunter analysis had been shaped, at least in part, by the author's desire to rescue George from the verdict of madness, to transform him from a psychiatric case into a medical victim. There was an implicit argument that physical illness was more dignified, more explicable, more sympathetic than mental illness. This is itself an interesting cultural moment. The effort to diagnose George with porphyria rather than a mental illness reflected assumptions about mental illness that were deeply embedded in mid-20th century medicine and society, assumptions about its stigma, its hereditary implications, its supposed intractability. The porphyria diagnosis, by contrast, offered the possibility of a clear biochemical mechanism, a specific genetic variant, a clean scientific explanation. The challenge to the porphyria diagnosis that emerged in the 2000s came from several directions simultaneously. A large study of the historical records led by the historian Timothy Peters and a team of researchers examined the symptoms described in the original medical documents against the diagnostic criteria for various types of porphyria and found a poor fit. The specific pattern of acute attacks, the neurological symptoms, the response to treatment, none of it mapped cleanly onto any identified form of porphyria. At the same time, an analysis by the psychiatrist Michael Dahl and others argued that the symptom pattern fit a manic-depressive disorder much more closely. The pressured speech, the elevated mood, the grandiosity, the decreased need for sleep, the agitation, these were the classic markers of a manic episode. The pattern of acute episodes followed by relative recovery, with eventual permanent deterioration in old age. This was consistent with bipolar disorder as it's understood today. The arsenic finding from 2004 added another layer of complexity. If George was chronically exposed to arsenic at significant levels, through his medicines, his environment, or both, this could have precipitated or worsened episodes of an underlying condition. It could also, in the absence of any other underlying condition, have produced the symptoms on its own. Arsenic poisoning at chronic levels can cause confusion, agitation, peripheral nerve damage, and a range of other symptoms. The abdominal pain that was so prominent throughout his illness is consistent with arsenic exposure. A 2016 study attempted to tie these threads together. Using samples of the king's hair that had been preserved in various collections, researchers measured not just arsenic levels but a range of other trace elements, and compared the findings with what was known about the medications and environmental exposures of the period. The arsenic levels found were, in the study's assessment, high enough to have contributed significantly to the neurological symptoms. Whether they were high enough to have caused the illness on their own, or whether they were acting on a person who had a pre-existing vulnerability to mental illness, remained uncertain. The honest answer, as of the present understanding, is that we do not know definitively what caused George III's illness. The most likely explanation is a combination: a genetic predisposition to a mood disorder, possibly bipolar disorder, which was exacerbated by chronic arsenic exposure and by the extraordinary stresses of his life, the loss of America, the political turbulence of his reign, the weight of duty maintained over 6 decades, the deaths of people he loved, and ultimately the death of Amelia, which seems to have been the final blow that took what remained. This is not a neat diagnosis. It does not resolve into a single explanation that can be written on a certificate and filed away. But it is probably closer to the truth than any simpler account. What matters in the end is not the name we give to what happened to him, but the experience itself. The man who had governed a global empire became a man who could not tell the living from the dead. The king who had believed, with genuine conviction, in his duty to his country and his God, spent the last decade of his life in rooms in Windsor, where that duty could no longer reach him. He suffered. He was sometimes comforted. He held on to music when everything else was gone. That is the story. And it is a story that medicine even now cannot entirely explain. The caricatures and the public imagination. There is another part of this story that tends to get left out of the serious historical accounts, and it is the part that ordinary people of the time were most directly exposed to: the satirical prints, the caricatures, the newspaper commentary, the theatre of public opinion that surrounded George III throughout his reign, and particularly during and after his illness. The late 18th century was a golden age of British political caricature. Artists like James Gilray, Thomas Rowlandson, and the Cruikshank family produced images of startling viciousness and extraordinary technical skill, images that circulated in print shops, that were copied and recopied, that reached audiences far beyond those who read the political pamphlets and parliamentary reports. George III was one of their favourite subjects. He was caricatured throughout his reign, not always cruelly, because the caricaturists' targets were often the politicians rather than the king himself, and George's personal decency and domesticity gave him a kind of sympathy that his ministers and his son did not always share. The images of him as Farmer George, a bluff, round, good-natured figure with a fondness for simple food and plain clothes, were often affectionate even when they were satirical. The Regency crisis changed this. Gilray in particular produced images during the 1788 to 1789 crisis that were savage in their political content. The politicians scrambling for power while the king lay ill, the Prince of Wales calculating his advantages, the Queen weeping in genuine anguish while her ladies-in-waiting manoeuvred. All of it was grist for a satirical tradition that had no instinct for restraint. The images raised questions about the nature of power, about what it meant to be a king who had lost his reason, about what kind of system produced a situation where the incapacity of one man could bring the machinery of government to a halt and throw the political world into chaos. These were not questions that the prince answered. They were too sharp and too immediate for that kind of reflection. But they put the questions in front of the reading public in a way that more sober commentary could not. The caricaturists' version of George III, the mad king, the muttering figure in his robes, the man who had lost himself, became embedded in the popular imagination in ways that persisted long after the historical details had faded. When people today speak of George III as the Mad King, they are drawing on an image that was shaped as much by Gilray and Rowlandson as by the actual historical record. This matters because it has distorted the history in ways that are hard to correct. The Mad King narrative is vivid and memorable, and it captures something real, but it captures only the last chapter of a 60-year reign, and it does so at the expense of everything that came before. It makes the illness the totality of the man, rather than one part, even if the most dramatic part, of a full and complicated life. The theatre of the period also engaged with the theme, though more carefully and obliquely. There were plays that touched on madness, on loss of reason, on the relationship between power and sanity, that were clearly shaped by awareness of the king's condition even when they did not address it directly. Shakespeare's King Lear, the story of an aging king who loses his mind while his children fight over his kingdom, was performed repeatedly during this period and received with unusual intensity by audiences who knew, and could not say directly, what they were really thinking about. Lear had been altered in the 17th century to give it a happy ending, because the original ending, in which Lear and Cordelia both die, and the tragedy as complete and unredeemed, had been considered too bleak for stage performance. During George III's reign, the play was performed in the altered version. It was not until 1838, nearly 20 years after George's death, that the original Shakespearean ending was restored to the stage. The timing's probably not coincidence. The cultural life of a country is shaped by what it cannot say directly. And what Britain could not say directly, for the 30 years of George III's confinement, was reflected in the plays it staged, the images it printed, the poems it wrote, the novels that explored themes of confinement and madness, and the gap between outward appearance and inner reality. Some of the most interesting writing of the period, Austen, Wollstonecraft, Godwin, the early Romantics, circled around questions of reason and feeling, of social constraint and individual experience, of what it meant to be a person subject to forces you could not control. These themes would have existed regardless of the king's illness, but the presence in the national consciousness of a mad king, a confined mind at the centre of the greatest empire on earth, gave those themes a particular urgency. The final years in detail. The decade between 1810 and 1820, the final decade of George III's life, deserves a closer look than it usually receives, because it is not simply a story of absence and decline. It is a story of a man living within a very particular kind of world, shaped by his condition, by the people around him, and by the physical space he inhabited. Windsor Castle in those years was a strange place. It was not, in the manner of the later Victorian period, a perfectly ordered and ceremonial royal residence. It was a working household, adapted to the needs of a very unusual situation. The care of a king who could no longer govern, who could no longer reliably distinguish the present from the past, who needed constant attention and management. The rooms assigned to George were comfortable. He was a king, even if an incapacitated one, and the resources of the crown were available for his care. He had fires, suitable clothes, food prepared to his preferences. He had attendants, footmen, pages, valets, men who had served him for years and who continued to treat him with the respect due to his position. But there was also the practical reality of caring for someone whose behaviour was unpredictable. There were periods of agitation when the king was difficult to manage, when he would become angry or restless or frightened, or when the voices and faces he was seeing required him to respond in ways that alarmed his attendants. There were periods of comparative calm when he was easier, gentler, sometimes even apparently content. The harpsichord features in multiple accounts from these years. It was in his rooms, he played it regularly. Sometimes he would play for long stretches, moving through pieces he had known all his life, finding his way through familiar music with a concentration that was not available to him in conversation or in most other activities. Music, for reasons that neurologists now understand better than anyone in George's time could have, often persists longer than other forms of memory. The pathways that store deeply learned musical patterns are among the most resilient in the brain. George could not always tell you who was Prime Minister or what year it was, but he could play Handel. He also sang. Not always coherently, not always in ways that made sense to observers, but he sang. He had a good voice, and the pleasure he took in music was genuine and deep. In a life that had been stripped of most of the things that had given it meaning and structure, music remained. There is an account from a courtier who saw him in these years of the king conducting an imaginary concert. He was in his room, dressed in his customary dressing gown, and he was conducting, waving his arms in the manner of a conductor, following the rhythms of some music that only he could hear, with an expression of apparent satisfaction. It is a strange image, and one that has lodged in accounts of his final years as somehow emblematic of his condition. A man conducting silence. But there is something else in that image, something that gets lost if you approach it only as evidence of decline. He was doing something he loved. He was in a world of music, even if that world existed only in his mind. The silence around him was not silence to him. His physical health held up reasonably well for most of the final decade. He ate with appetite when the food was presented to him. He moved around his rooms. He was not, for much of this period, in obvious physical pain. The abdominal troubles that had been so prominent during the earlier episodes were less severe, or perhaps simply less remarked upon. His eyesight, which had been declining for years, became extremely poor, and by his final years he was essentially blind. His hearing also deteriorated. The world of the senses was closing down around him as well as the world of the mind. He was, in the last years, in a condition of profound sensory and cognitive isolation. The visits of his surviving children, when they occurred, were complex affairs. Some of the sons came regularly, others less so for reasons of distance or reluctance, or their own complicated feelings about what they were witnessing. The daughters, who lived more restricted lives, were in some cases more consistently present. Princess Mary, in particular, is described as attentive and caring in these years, bringing what comfort she could. The political world outside Windsor continued to generate events that would have consumed George utterly had he been well. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 had already confirmed British naval supremacy. The Peninsular War dragged on through the early years of the Regency, Wellington advancing slowly up through Spain against French armies that were increasingly stretched by the demands of the Russian campaign. The burning of Washington by British forces in 1814, Waterloo in 1815, the final defeat of Napoleon. George III had spent most of his adult life in conflict with France, in one form or another. The long wars that had defined his reign, the 7 Years' War, the American conflict, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, were all in some sense episodes in the Anglo-French rivalry that stretched back centuries. The final defeat of Napoleon, which resolved that rivalry more completely than any previous outcome, happened while George was at Windsor, conducting imaginary concerts. He was not told. There was no point in telling him. He could not have processed the information or understood its significance. The news of Waterloo, the greatest British military victory in a generation, was received by a king who was not there to receive it. It is one of the sadder ironies of his story. He had been, throughout his long reign, deeply engaged with the wars against France. He had written to generals, followed campaigns, worried over dispatches, grieved over losses. He had lived through decade after decade of conflict with a country that was simultaneously Britain's greatest rival and, in certain aristocratic drawing rooms, the cultural standard against which Britain measured itself. And then, when the final victory came, he was gone. Legacy and reassessment. The history of how we have thought about George III is almost as interesting as the history of George III himself. For the first half of the 19th century, the dominant narrative was shaped by those who had lived through his reign and experienced it personally. The politicians, the diarists, the memoirists who knew him, or knew people who had known him. Their accounts were mixed, some sympathetic, some critical, most acknowledging the complexity of a man who'd been both admirable and frustrating, both a figure of genuine dignity and a source of real political trouble. The American tradition was from the beginning less generous. The Declaration of Independence, with its list of grievances against the king, had fixed a particular image of George III in American political memory, the tyrant, the oppressor, the man against whom revolution was necessary. This image persisted. It served a political purpose, and political purposes give images considerable staying power. American histories of the Revolutionary period return to it repeatedly, each generation reinforcing what the previous one had established. The British reassessment came gradually. The Victorian era was more sympathetic. George's domestic virtues, his genuine religious faith, his commitment to duty, resonated with a period that valued those things. The comparison with his son George IV, whose extravagance and self-indulgence were deeply unpopular, also worked in his favour. Farmer George, against the excesses of the Regency, was a flattering contrast. The 20th century brought more scholarly attention, and eventually the medical debates that have been described at length here. The Porphyria theory, when it appeared in 1969, reshaped the scholarly conversation for a generation. It offered a story in which the king was a victim rather than a case study, a man who had suffered from a physical illness that was poorly understood and poorly treated, not a man who had simply gone mad. There is a strand of feeling in these reassessments that is worth acknowledging directly. The effort to find a dignifying medical explanation for George III's condition reflects something real about how we think about illness, about suffering, about the relationship between a person's character and what happens to them. The desire to say, it was the porphyria, it was the arsenic, it was the physical disease, not his mind, not his character, not his weakness, is a desire to protect him from a verdict that still carries stigma. But mental illness is not a weakness of character. The man who suffered through the episodes of 1788, 1801, and 1804, and who descended into the permanent illness of 1810, was not a different or lesser person for that suffering. He was the same man who had governed with genuine seriousness for 50 years, who had built a library, founded an academy, farmed his land, loved his family, and tried, with imperfect but real success, to be the kind of king he believed his country needed. The broader cultural lesson from George's story, the one that reaches beyond the specific facts of his diagnosis and treatment, is about how societies handle those at the edges of their capacity for understanding. 18th century Britain had no real framework for mental illness. It had institutions that were often brutal and inadequately supervised. It had a medical profession that was beginning to modernise but had not yet found its footing in this particular area. And when the king himself crossed into that territory, the response was improvised, uncertain, political, and deeply personal all at once. What might have been different if the understanding had existed? If the physicians of 1788 had known what we know now about mood disorders, about the brain, about the biochemistry of episodes like the one the king was experiencing, might he have been helped more effectively? Might the worst of his suffering have been reduced? Might the final decade at Windsor have looked different? There is no useful answer to that question. History does not run on alternatives, but it is worth holding on to as a reminder that the limits of any era's medicine are not the limits of what is possible, only the limits of what is known so far. The people who came after George III built on what his case had revealed, imperfectly and slowly, until the understanding began to improve. The illness was part of his story. It was not all of his story. The most useful modern assessments of George III are the ones that hold both things at once: the genuine accomplishments of the reign and the genuine tragedy of its end. The intelligent, earnest, stubborn, deeply dutiful man who came to the throne in 1760, and the confused, suffering figure in the rooms at Windsor who played his harpsichord and conducted his silent concerts. These are not two different people. They are the same person, before and after, the same consciousness having the very different experiences that one human life can contain. He was not the mad king. He was a man who, among many other things, went mad. There is a difference. It is not always easy to maintain, in the face of a story as dramatic as his, but it is worth maintaining. The Room at Windsor. On January 29, 1820, at Windsor Castle, George III died. He was 81 years old. The man who had come to the throne 60 years earlier had faced the loss of America, the upheaval of the French Revolution, 2 decades of war against Napoleon, repeated episodes of devastating illness, the deaths of his wife and his most beloved daughter, and the slow removal of everything that had given his life its structure and meaning. He had held on through all of it. He had died in his own rooms, in his own castle, surrounded by the trappings of a kingdom he could no longer perceive. He left behind a country transformed. The Britain of 1820 was not the Britain of 1760, in almost any respect you might choose to examine: its geography, its economy, its social structure, its place in the world. The empire he had inherited was the foundation of the empire that would, in the reign of his granddaughter Victoria, become the largest in human history. The constitutional arrangements he had struggled to shape had evolved into something more stable and durable than anything he had imagined, though in a direction he would probably not have chosen. He left behind a family. 9 of his 15 children survived him. The family he had raised, the family he had loved with genuine warmth and worried over with genuine anxiety, went on without him. George IV, the Prince Regent who became king on his father's death, would reign until 1830. William IV would follow until 1837. And then came Victoria, the granddaughter George never knew, who would reign until 1901, and whose reign would define British identity in ways that George's reign had only begun. He left behind a question that medicine and history have been wrestling with ever since. What happened to him? The arsenic in his blood? The disordered biochemistry that may have been porphyria, or may have been something else? The long genetic thread of whatever predisposition ran through the family? None of it, even now, resolves cleanly. There is something almost fitting about that unresolved question, even if fitting is not the same as comforting. George III spent his reign resisting the neatness that others wanted to impose on his life and his power, resisting the Whig politicians who wanted him to be a figurehead, resisting the Tory managers who wanted him to be purely compliant, resisting the easy narratives that others wrote around him. In death, he resists neat explanation still. What the historical record gives us, with all its gaps and contradictions and layers of interpretation, is a man who lived an extraordinary life in extraordinary times, who bore enormous burdens with varying degrees of grace, and who ultimately was overcome by something inside him that he could neither understand nor escape. The specific biochemistry, the genetic inheritance, the environmental exposures, all of that is the machinery behind the experience. The experience itself was simply what it was, a long suffering, a gradual loss, and a death at 81 in a room at Windsor that had once been part of the greatest palace in the world and had become, by the end, simply the room where he lived. And he left behind, in the rooms at Windsor where he spent his last decade, the image of a king who had become something else entirely. Not a king anymore, not in any functional sense. A man. A very old, very ill, very alone man in a room full of familiar things, playing the music he had loved all his life into the silence. The history of his reign is the history of an era. The history of his illness is the history of a person. Both are worth knowing. Both are worth remembering. What happened at Windsor in those final years was not a metaphor for the limits of power, though it might be read as one. It was not a parable about the fragility of reason, though it might be read as that too. It was the end of a life, the specific, irreducible, unrepeatable end of a specific life, the life of a man who had tried very hard to be what he believed the world needed him to be, and who had been overtaken in the end by forces that neither he nor anyone around him understood. George III, King of Great Britain and Ireland, died on January 29, 1820. He was 81 years old, and he had been king for 59 years, 3 months and 3 days. He is buried at St George's Chapel, Windsor, in a tomb that he shares with the Queen, who spent nearly 60 years beside him and preceded him in death by 14 months. The harpsichord was, presumably, moved. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.